actually, I'm really interested in Lewis's reasons for thinking that causation needs to have this reductive analysis rather than being subject to the Canberra plan.
Oh, okay.
And so I want to, first of all, ask you about this counterpart of Lewis who had applied the Canberra plan to causation. It seems like this Lewis counterpart would accept plausible interpretation, but maybe deny both weaker view and stronger view. Because then we would have, in our world, certain relations playing the causation role, and then in the other worlds that are imagined there, other relations playing the causation role, and actually, they would always be in line with our concept, of one and the same concept of causation. So, what reason would Lewis have for not liking this approach? And are those reasons going to be similar to the ones that Hume gives for wanting to shy away from this sort of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, this is just speculation, right? But I think that it looks to me as though the answer is necessary connections are unintelligible, right? What would those intra-world relations have to be like? They would have to be relations that kind of have modal import. And we know that intrinsic relations can't have modal import, and so something like that. Is that not enough?
So we can't apply the Canberra plan to anything. We can't give a functional analysis of anything that has modal import.
Well, yeah. Okay. So that was too quick. Right. So So if you think about the case of mental states, right? So there's a sense. So we go to a possible world where pain is an irreducibly mental feature. Of course, it has modal import in the sense that it has certain kinds of causes and effects, right? But it's having those causes and effects is itself just a matter of, right? We just give an interworld analysis of that, right? What happens at the closest possible worlds, and so on and so on and so on. So if it was going to be some intrinsic relation that just by virtue of its very nature generates regularities or something like that, that kind of looks like that's going to be a different kind of modal import, right? So when we look at the closest possible worlds, we're now going to be constrained by the kind of intrinsic nature of that relation to go to certain kinds of worlds rather than other ones, right? It's not the kind of bare existence of that property. It's that, well, if that property, we can't now go to a possible world, say, where that property obtains but various regularities don't hold, right? Because it's a constraint on that, it's being that very property that those regularities do hold, or something like that. So I haven't spelled that out very well, but it's going to be something like that, right? The thought that there are modal constraints on whether or not that property is instantiated, right? That the mere instantiation of this quality, if you like, is now going to have implications for what's going to count as close possible worlds, by virtue of which we now get to wheel out our story about what causes what, or something like that. That was a bit vague. Does that make sense, though?
That makes sense.
Okay, excellent, good.
Very.
So, I want to offer a suggestion for seeing Hume and Lewis as closer methodologically than you made them seem, but maybe motivationally further apart as a consequence. So, you characterize Hume as interested in genetic or epistemological questions, whereas Lewis is interested in ontology. But if you hold, everything I know about Hume I learned from Jen, but if you hold, like Jen argued, that sort of the rejection of the unintelligibility of natural necessity comes out of semantic empiricism, and what drives it is not so much a psychological or epistemological question, but a semantic inquiry, and semantics is the gateway to metaphysics or to ontology, right? If you know when claims are true, arguably, then you're close at least to knowing what makes them true. And in fact, Lewis's own ontology is driven by a semantic conception. So the commonality, the methodological commonality would be a fundamentally semantic commitment, which might show that sort of motivations are further apart.
All right, okay, yeah, no, good. I guess it seems to me that Hume's interest insofar as he is interested in the semantics of causation, which I'm inclined to think he isn't that interested in actually, but insofar as he is, it's being driven by the empiricism, right? So he's got a very hardcore empiricist view about what we can meaningfully talk about, and that's what's driving the semantics, right? So now we need to give a story about what we mean that only engages with stuff we can, cognitively engage with. So in a sense, I think that still counts as a kind of genetic epistemological concern, right? We start out with a view about which aspects of reality we can engage with, and then that drives a semantic story about what we can possibly mean when we go around using our words. Right? Whereas with Lewis, like, the interest in the semantics is not, as far as I can tell, being driven by by that kind of concern, right? So they've both got the semantics there, you're right. But they're being driven by quite different reasons for having whatever semantic views they have. And it kind of seems to me that in some sense at least, Hume, kind of unlike Lewis maybe, is not, like semantics kind of isn't the royal road to metaphysics, right? So it gives us a story about what we can intelligibly say about the world. And maybe that closes off some kind of ontological possibilities as kind of genuinely conceivable, but in some sense I think he just kind of doesn't care what's out there, right? Call this, of course there could be relations between causes and effects, right? But who cares whether they exist or not, right? Lewis kind of does care whether they exist or not. So I think I kind of want to hold on to the idea that by and large Lewis is kind of like, Lewis is fundamentally interested in giving a story about ontology, whereas Hume is fundamentally interested in telling a story about, even though you're right that there is the kind of commonality in that they're both interested in, what stuff means, right? They're interested in semantics.
Andre?
This really, I think it's a bit of a follow-up with Barry's question, but it's also a follow-up about, you were raising the question about supposing and conceiving. Because supposing suggests too that you might get a little closer. If you can suppose it, I mean, maybe that's a kind of wrong-headed intuition, but it seems like you're closer. And conceiving is maybe even closer still. I don't know how you think of it, but and to really be skeptical about something, my intuition is that if it's really unintelligible, it's hard to be skeptical about it. You've got to be able to at least be able to entertain the thing about which you have some skepticism. I mean, if it's unintelligible, and if not unintelligible, most certainly false, well, that's one thing. Where not unintelligible, certainly false or true, or about which you could be skeptical.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, I think. Right, so Galen Strawson, when he's lambasting the kind of traditional reductionist story about Hume on causation, kind of attributes to people who interpret Hume in that way the view that it attributes to Hume according to those people that there's no such thing as natural necessity. This thing couldn't possibly exist, and I think that's not the view. The view is simply we just can't even so much as really intelligibly formulate the question whether these things exist or not. Right? That just kind of completely lies out with our conceptual competence. So I suppose, all right, so skepticism. Does Lewis think that these things could exist? Right, so I mean, that's the question, right? Does he think that these things could exist? I mean, in a sense, that's what I wanted to say, like your answer to that question on his behalf depends a bit on the extent to which you can attribute to him the view that we can even so much as ask that question, right? Yeah. And I'm a bit inclined to think that he thinks that we kind of can't really ask that. Or insofar as we can ask that question, we already know what the answer, I mean, we already know by asking the question that we're actually asking a question that doesn't make any sense, and hence, right?
And at that point, Hume may be in Lewis part company. No?
Oh, okay, right, so because Hume, at that, yeah, no, okay, maybe that's right. So Hume at that point just wants to say, can we just stop talking about this now, right? We have nothing to say, whereas Lewis is kind of saying, no, actually, there just aren't any possible worlds in which these things exist, right? Because they automatically violate the constraints on modality. Okay, right, yeah, no, maybe that's right. Okay, which I guess that ties in with the that sort of thought that, look, Lewis is kind of doing ontology and Hume is not really doing ontology. So that difference between them still, even though I was trying to draw this commonality, that difference between them is still coming out, even given all of this stuff, right? So Lewis on that stronger view is saying, look, there are just no possible worlds where these things exist, whereas Hume isn't saying that. He's simply saying, that's a question we can't even intelligibly ask, right? And so, the question of whether there are possible worlds where these things exist or not is just that's just not a question, right? Is that what you meant? That sounds right, I guess.
Yeah. It seems I thought part of the purpose, but then Don maybe should comment on this, trying to sort of say something about you could suppose that was to preserve to bring the skeptical argument, to keep it alive. That we tend to all think of, well, Hume is this, I don't know about great skeptic, this great skeptic. And it's a way of holding on to, bringing the skepticism in. I mean, Don made a point of that, bringing it in. And so
right.
It makes me think that Hume can't be too much like Lewis on this. But Lewis is more convinced of the unintelligibility.
Okay. Right. Yeah. No. Maybe that's right. Maybe he is more convinced of the unintelligibility. Yeah. I mean, as I said, I'm not now sure. Maybe I should just get Don to answer this question about because I think I was running together the question about whether something was conceivable and whether it was epistemically possible, right? And then what you said made me think, okay, I can see that there's a way of reading Hume according to which those two things just come apart, right? Or at least conceivable in the sense that you could have a relative idea, you could suppose that thing exists, right? So it was consistent with what you said that, look, we can suppose that necessary connections exist, whatever they might be like. But now that's not going to entail that it's epistemically possible that they exist. But do you think it is presumably going to turn out that it's epistemically possible?
Well,
I mean, it's not like
in some sense, you haven't fully, with a relative idea, you haven't fully specified an epistemic situation
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
Express the question whether it's epistemically possible or not. But that, I think, generally leaving open the epistemic possibility that there's some relation of which we only have a relative idea, which if we had a better idea of it, we'd see that there is this further kind of necessity from the question of, so that's epistemically possible.
Right.
But whether the thing that is epistemically possible, we got around to filling it out, trying to fill it out, would turn out to be something that was conceivable or not, where we tried to specify exactly how the thing does the underlying. That might turn out to be inconceivable. So it's sort of like Goldbach's conjecture epistemically possible,
right.
If it's true, can I really conceive how it's false?
Okay,
No,
right,
really.
yeah. Okay, right, so epistemically possible, it might just be epistemically possible so long as we don't try too hard to spell out the details.
Yeah,
right,
exactly,
okay, and then it's
yeah.
stopped. Right, okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense, thanks.
My question. So make question. Before I ask you the question, I just want to make an observation about endurance in Hume, which is, given his account of time, there can be things that exist with no temporal parts while being simultaneous with successive things that do have temporal parts. So that on one conception of endurance, there are things that exist at more than one moment in the entire history of the universe without themselves having any temporal parts. That
Okay,
has to
right,
do with
right.
the fact that they don't, there's things that by themselves don't change, by themselves don't have any temporal parts.
Oh, okay, right, yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, then the main question I wanted to ask was, it's maybe a sympathetic to Hume question about where the semantics are coming from, partly a request for information about Lewis. So one thing you might think is that the reason why people introduced powers in the first place was partly to underwrite counterfactuals, to explain the truth conditions for counterfactuals, not only natural necessity, but also natural possibility, and to talk about what would have happened under various circumstances. So in a way, it seems question begging on Lewis's part to give an analysis of counterfactuals that's in terms of laws understood as systems account, because what people who believed in powers said was that's not the way to understand counterfactuals. That's not the correct semantics for counterfactuals. And so, I mean, I think Hume's approach to semantics is the psychology informs the semantics. So first do the cognitive psychology and figure out how the various concepts are working, and then it'll show you what your semantic resources are. And from his standpoint, the upshot is, I think, roughly as systems accounts, the right count of laws, those underwrite counterfactuals. If there are any other realist modalities out there, if there are any other kinds of necessity, they'll have their own modality, they have their own counterfactual structure. They be a different set of, be done in terms of different relations among worlds or not in terms of relations among worlds at all. So in principle, that seems like a reasonable approach. Let the psychology inform the semantics. But what is it that's informing the semantics in Lewis's case that's not psychology? And the sort of "I am not appeased" remark suggests it's sort of introspective satisfaction. Another suggestion is it's really done by the epistemology. Look, I know these counterfactuals are true, and this is all I'm going on, so this must be the semantics for them. But that's sort of open to the suggestion, well, how do you know that those counterfactuals are right? If it's really, counterfactuals really depend on powers, then you don't really know that these
Right.
counterfactuals are true. You've just got good evidence
Yeah.
that they're true because that systems account is some good evidence about how the powers are distributed, but that's all it is. So really the question is, what is Lewis's direction, and is it as good as coming from psychology if it's not coming from psychology?
Right, so I guess the answer to that question is, I mean, Lewis thinks that our metaphysics, and I guess the same goes for the semantics, needs to be driven by a common sense theory, right? So you want to, by our common sense theory, right? So you want to know what pain is. Well, look at the way we use the word pain, what kinds of people in what kinds of situations we attribute pain to them, and now we figure out what it means for something to be in pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's all based on common sense, which kind of is, I guess, isn't quite the same as the psychology, but it's sort of in the same ballpark. But I think what that goes along with, and this is kind of speculative as well, because Lewis wrote a lot and I haven't read it all, but I think he has a general commitment to the idea that our common sense theory of the world just doesn't cut very deep into the heart of its ontological structure, right? So we go around making claims about essences and things, but when someone says, and that talk's incredibly badly behaved, right? Incredibly context sensitive, and when people come along and say things like, oh, but surely, whether something has an essence isn't sensitive to context because it's a modal feature of you. I think Lewis's line is, well, where in common sense theory did we sign up to that, right? What things do we go around saying to each other that implicate in that level of kind of heavy-duty ontology, right? And so I guess I want to say he's going to say the same sort of thing about when it comes to, for example, truth conditions for counterfactuals, right? So now here we are, we go around making lots of counterfactual claims. We take ourselves to be able to assert certain kinds of counterfactuals with a high degree of confidence and deny other ones. here's an account of the semantics that pretty much gets all of that right, or that's the claim. But kind of that's it, right? That's as far that like. So the idea that we ought to accommodate the thought that what makes the counterfactual true is some intrinsic modal feature of the object in question. I think Lewis's response is going to be, sorry, which part of common sense theory tells us that the truth of the counterfactuals is driven by some intrinsic modal feature of the object, right? Like, we just don't go around exhibiting those sorts of ontological commitments in our daily lives, right? Certain philosophers do that kind of thing when they're talking about philosophy, but it's no part of our common sense theory, and so that's kind of an intuition that we just don't need to respect. I think that's kind of the way it goes, right? So the idea that analysing causation in terms of counterfactuals kind of gets the priority the wrong way around, or something like that. I think the kind of Lewisian response to that is common sense theory takes no view about which one is more fundamental than which. We make a load of causal claims, we make a load of counterfactual claims. Look, these two things go together really well. So it turns out that you can give a counterfactual analysis of causation. Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
it
think
seems close to the view that, I mean, in general, semantic reductionism, if it's done well, will correspond to the judgments that it's trying to capture. But that doesn't necessarily show that the common sense theory is a reductionistic one. If you ask people about their common sense, it's often, no, that what you're treating as the thing itself is really just evidence of something that I'm postulating as the underlying explanation. Okay? So I don't know to what extent the common folk believed in Power's law was pretty commonsensical kind of.
Yeah, so I think it's an open question, the extent to which our common sense theory enshrines fairly robust kind of ontological views. I mean, I kind of like Lewis to be right that it doesn't, because otherwise, a lot of his story is not going to work at all, right? But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Oh, so I think this is like a very closely related question that we put it a little differently. So you gave sort of three arguments for why Lewis thinks that natural necessity is unintelligible. So the first one was that once you have Lewis's analysis of laws and causation, then there's sort of no conceptual space for necessary connections. And the second one was in terms of possible world semantics. Once you accept possible world semantics, then there's no room for intra-world modality. The worry is that you might think that the reason to accept Lewis's account of laws and causation and possible world semantics is that you think natural necessity is unintelligible. And it seems like if that's your motivation, right, then those arguments aren't going to help you, right? Because you sort of, I mean, they might be right, but it seems like isn't the motivation for giving this kind of account of laws and causation and for possible world semantics might be that one thinks natural necessity is unintelligible. So then then it seems like there's the third argument, right, which is the Armstrong. I mean, that's the Armstrong and the strong biceps point. But that I find like really cryptic, and I wasn't sure. I mean, that just seems like he's just saying, look, Armstrong's necessitation relation is just unintelligible. But I don't quite see what the argument is in that
there wasn't
case,
really
right?
an
I
argument.
mean, or if he had. I mean, so maybe it's a sort of maybe he thinks that Armstrong just isn't giving an explanation of why the N relation is a necessitation relation, that he's just sort of solving the problem by kind of brute force by saying, look, this is just a necessitation relation, and that's whereas maybe Lewis is offering better. He's offering an explanation or something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, that would be a reasonable thing to think, and so I mean, most people who talk about that passage kind of take Lewis to be pointing at the kind of the inference problem and the identification problem, right? So the inference problem, how can it how do we show that the necessitation relation holding between these two universals kind of entails that all F's are G's, right? But yeah, so, this is just kind of interpretation, right? But I'm reading him in a much stronger and kind of more Humean way, which kind of says, just what would it be for some, some just contingent feature of reality, the existence of that thing, to genuinely entail that whenever you've got one of these things, you've got one of these things, right? Genuine entailment, like, that's just completely mysterious, right? That feels a lot like doing the thing that Don was talking about, right? Where you kind of mistake sort of logical necessity for some kind of natural inferential relation, right? It feels a lot like that kind of move. But that is just kind of, right, he doesn't say much, it's just that, and you're right, there's no argument there, it's just so I kind of wasn't trying to claim he was right, I was just trying to claim, look, here's some evidence for him thinking that this stuff is unintelligible, like he says it's unintelligible. I mean, yeah, you might interpret that to mean something, I was interpreting unintelligible there in quite a strong way, you might merely regard it as merely a request for more information, right, which is not forthcoming. So going back to the first bit, so you might worry that the motivation for signing up for a kind of a counterfactual account of causation and the best systems account of laws and all of that stuff is precisely coming from the, I think I don't know about Lewis, right? So, Lewis is in this very odd position where kind of in 1986, having published all of this stuff, he goes, oh, in retrospect, it seems to me that I'm kind of a bit of a Humean. And that's what I was trying to do all those times. Like, seriously, you didn't notice until now? And it's kind of miraculous. Too miraculous to be believable, I think, that his account of the similarity relation, in particular, is one that kind of is so Humean, right? It's just the distribution of matters, particular matters of fact, right? That's all that's going on. Like, who would come, and miraculously, that very account, that very similarity relation is the one that happens to correspond to all our intuitive counterfactual judgments, right? That's an extraordinary miracle, I bet, that really is. Strikes me that maybe there was sort of, something a bit more going on there. And certainly now, because 1986 is a long time ago, right? Precisely, people are kind of attracted to the possible world's account of, the counterfactual account of causation and the best system account of law, precisely because they kind of have the Humean intuitions, and those are the theories that do justice to them. But I think that's okay. So what I was really trying to do was just sort of present some evidence, right, that Lewis's view about natural necessity is much more kind of robust and more sort of Humean than his view about, say, enduring entities or mental states or whatever. It wasn't supposed to be a kind of like, here's an argument for thinking that Lewis is right. Because, if it was supposed to be an argument, it's not a very good argument, because precisely it gets the order the wrong way around, right? You can't sort of say, well, look, counterfactual analysis of causation works really well. Well, it kind of doesn't, but let's suppose it does. That's really good evidence that natural necessity is an unintelligible notion, right? That would be a really bad argument, I think. But it does. But the fact that Lewis has that account of causation is kind of some evidence that he's suspicious about necessity.
Well, at the very least, it shows you we can do without it. If the accounts of law, right? Well, look, you don't need this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that
So it gets you part of the way to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I must have some mistaken view about doing it, because I'm having a problem following some of this debate. To me, it seems like what you're saying is just obviously right, but that's probably because I'm wrong. I thought that a very famous view of Hume's is that it's a priori evident that there are no necessary connections between distinct events. Is that not so?
I don't think it's a priori evident. God. I don't know what to say about that. I don't think it's a priori evident, is it?
I always thought that that's what he was saying, but if that were so, would that follow that Darwin's view was wrong? I don't know if I'm following the debate here. Does Darwin's view imply that there may be necessary connections between events according to Hume? Is that what Darwin's view implies? Because I thought that was just ruled out by Hume over and over again.
You, right, so there's a question about whether there could, in principle, be necessary connections between distinct existences, right? So if we hold the distinctness of causes and effects fixed, I guess it is going to be a priori evident that there can't be, or at least there can't be logically necessary relations between them, right? Because it's always going to be possible that the cause happens and the effect doesn't happen.
So is it a priori evident that God is wrong?
I very much doubt that. But that leaves open the possibility that there, I mean, in principle, it's not a priori evident, I don't think, for Hume that there's not some kind of weaker form of connection between causes and effects, right? That doesn't amount to something like logical entailment, right?
So weaker entailment?
Pardon?
There can be all kinds of relations, but you mean some other kind of entailment?
Something that's kind of weaker than entailment, but somehow still underpins inference. See, now that sounds kind of crazy, but that's kind of the issue, right? So Don's line, I take it, correct me if I'm wrong, is, look, it's consistent with Hume's story about the semantics of our causal talk, which just latches onto the regularities, that we can at least contemplate the supposition that there might be some sort of relation between, there could be some kind of relation between causes and effects that somehow underpins that could, in principle, were we to be very different cognitive creatures to the ones we are, somehow underpin our inferences or something like that. Now, so as he said, it might be epistemically possible that there is such a thing, only if you don't try and spell out the details too much, and as soon as you try and spell out the details, it turns out that that's just not epistemically possible at all. So the question is whether we can so much as entertain the supposition that there could be some kind of additional relationship between causes and effects that isn't logical necessity, but is somehow some sort of intrinsic relation. Or, I mean, here's another possibility. So this is what you get in John Wright. John Wright's view is that causes and effects aren't distinct at all. In fact, and there really is a relation of logical necessity between them. And it's a kind of a little bit like you get in the sort of, a little bit like sort of contemporary sort of dispositional essentialist views, right? So you think of fundamental dispositions, and it just, if you have a fundamental disposition, that just entails that you're going to behave in certain kinds of ways. And that's not to violate the claim that you can't have necessary connections between distinct existences, because in some sense the cause and effect now are not really are not logically distinct, right, precisely because there are entailment relations between them. So John Wright thinks that that's actually the view that Hume has, right? That is actually what the world is like.
The reductio to Spinoza.
Okay,
Hume
right.
properly
So,
understood as Spinoza.
okay,
Yeah.
so but I take it that it's consistent with the kind of line that Don was pursuing earlier on. That's not the way things are for Hume, but it's certainly a way that we could, at least prima facie, kind of imagine them to be. I mean, maybe if you reflected on it, it would turn out to be sort of, really not possible, but at least on the surface of it, that's an intelligible supposition that the world could be that way. It's just that doesn't engage with our actual causal talk, because we have no access to that. I'm not trying to make the view plausible.
It's unintelligible to me at the moment.
Okay, well it's kind of unintelligible to me. That's precisely in a way the distinction between the strong and the weak, right? Is that mere supposition? Is there something that's kind of intelligible enough that even counts as a kind of supposition, or is it all just, is it just like gargling, right? I'm a little bit inclined to say it's like gargling, but Don wants to say there is some supposition that you can make there.
There's some words in the gargle.
Right,
It's
yes.
as close to 2 and 3 making 6, but is that what we're comparing to? I mean, it's not worse than 2 and 3 making 6.
Yeah, so yeah.
It's better than 2 and 3.
It's better.
So, the two relative idea scenarios I have in mind are, there are two different scenarios. One is, we already know what causal necessity is, but there could be some other kind of necessity. How do I conceive that? Just as resembling the two kinds of necessity I know, which applies to distinct things, but nevertheless underwrites causation. And you would call it a kind of necessity if you understood what it was, but you don't. So I just take that on faith. And the other is the right view, according to which while the separability principle guarantees that whatever is difference distinct and separable in the imagination, and so you won't see an entailment of one from the other. It's not a priori that your ideas of the things that are causes and effects are adequate representations of them. And so if there could be some other kind of idea which was a more adequate representation of them, which would allow you to see that your imagining of them as one without the other was really incorrect and an inadequate understanding.
The issue Eli is raising is exactly the issue I was trying to raise before about, is it necessarily true that every change must have an efficient cause? And in this particular case, can we know that, and that's precisely the core of Hume's argument, and everything we've said today presupposes that you can't know that, because that's the only reason to make all of the desperate moves Hume makes about causality, because he claims, when he says distinct perceptions can be separated, he means you can't get a contradiction by denying that B must be a cause of A, because a contradiction only concerns a thing identity with itself. And up until Hume, every philosopher would have believed and said that, almost every, excuse me, no universal principles. To be an analytic truth doesn't mean it's not about the world. The only reason we believe that people have since thought about analytic truth as, well, it must be about words or concepts or a priori forms or this or that, is because we've accepted Hume's incorrect argument that you can't get a contradiction out of the statement that a change does not have an efficient cause. And you can get, as far as I'm concerned, get a contradiction out of it. And so when you come to the question of possible world necessity, I'll say, well, that's perfectly fine, if you want to talk about possible worlds, but I can get you that contradiction. And if you think it's still not necessary, then you can call necessity anything you want, but I happen to know that it's contradictory for a change, or at least this, a newly occurring change, as opposed to, let's say, an Aristotelian eternal change. A newly occurring change not to have an efficient cause. But all I'm saying here is not to agree with me, but I'm just my thought, Eli is correct, that it's all based on that argument of Hume, and which, well, I only know one philosopher in the world who's denying it, that's me. But that's, no, seriously, but it's all based on that. I mean, we don't see the importance of everything we talk about today is floating on that acceptance of Hume. So much of that, what we're talking about today, is floating on that argument, which is precisely that there is no a priori, if you want to call it that, connection between, and there cannot be an a priori connection. And that means it can't be contradictory for there to be absent connection between distinct events.
Okay, so you want to say it's analytic that every...
Well, if you want, but I'm just saying that Eli is quite correct. I mean, this is the basis of Hume and everything we think about analytic. No, because what does the word analytic mean to you? It would mean something different for me, because I don't accept the post-Humean, or let's say posthumous version. But I'm not asking you. I'm not trying to impose my weird ideas of analytic on anybody else. I'm just trying to say that this is the basis of Hume. If you don't accept that in Hume, then you don't need anything else in Hume. And that, so Eli is perfectly correct that that's the core. That he rejects the a priori, a connection between distinct existences, and therefore has to come up with all of their, weird interpretations of causality. And he's forced into it, and hoisted by his own petard, basically.
You want to answer that, and then we're gonna move on to the next question.
I don't think I have enough. Well, yeah, I'll just say this. So on a kind of on the sort of John Wright skeptical realist view about Hume, it sounds like he pushes Hume at least part of the way to where you think the truth lies, which is to say he takes Hume to think that our causal talk, although our idea of necessary connection is kind of complete, is entirely imperfect, because our cognitive limitations mean that we do experience events as distinct, really, they're not distinct at all. They really are logically connected. You know, there are entailment relations between them. I mean, so as it were, on the metaphysics point of view, that is, or at least that's what we ascribe. In some sense, that's what we ascribe to the world when we make our necessity claims. It's just that we can't adequately really represent that in our causal choice. So it sounds like that's halfway to the place that you think is the true position, right? It's just that you think that we can in fact adequately represent it.
All I'm trying to say is that, no, I don't want to make you get an argument. I would just say, for instance, logical entailment. Prior to Hume, that would have been called a logical entailment. It's only because of Hume's denial of statements that are obviously about the world, like every change needs a cause, that we think that the claim that something is necessarily true implies that it's logical or conceptual or linguistic or there's something other than just plain old-fashioned about what's out there. And the fact that he would say, well, it's a logical entailment shows that he's still posthumous.
Yeah.
But again, I don't want to take it off. That's just what I'm trying to say.
I think that was a good day for philosophy myself, but you know.
Let's move on.
So I hope this isn't just a version of the same issue, but so I'm thinking about Berkeley, actually, who also thinks that there's no such thing as natural necessity. And sometimes he thinks this on Humean grounds, by which I just mean sort of on the grounds of a sort of epistemological claim. We can think the opposite of this or something. But he also does seem to hold this view on ontological grounds, because he does want to say there is no intrinsic connection between what we consider, right, between this thing and that thing. And so then the question is, what does he mean by intrinsic exactly, right? So how does this sort of get cashed out? And this does have something to do with, I think, what Don was saying before and others about this confusion that I think Berkeley thinks is happening between a sort of logical necessity and a kind of causal necessity, right? So this is, his way of wanting to deny an intrinsic connection is to say effects don't fall out of causes the way conclusions fall out of premises. It's a wrong way to think about what they are. So this gives him grounds for denying a kind of natural necessity in the book. It gives him all kinds of grounds for doing that too. So I wonder, like when Lewis wants to deny a kind of intrinsic relation, is it the same sort of thing? Is it the same sort of claim about a sort of confusion between logical necessity and causal necessity, or is it something else?
Yeah, so the problem is that Lewis just doesn't say nearly enough about this.
For me to be able to say that, I think. So so when he makes those unintelligibility claims against Armstrong, my interpretation of that is that something like that is going on, right? So Armstrong postulates this relation of necessity that holds between, universals F and G, and the obtaining of that relation of necessity is supposed to now guarantee. There's kind of two guarantees, right? Kind of guarantees that every time you have an F, that in turn is going to guarantee that there's a G, and that's supposed to be some kind of entailment relation, right? That's a kind of logical guarantee. And I take it that when Lewis says, look, that's just unintelligible, he's precisely getting at that idea that the idea of ascribing logical necessity to some kind of relation out there in the world, intrinsic relation out there in the world, just kind of doesn't really make any sense. But as I say, that's sort of speculative because he just doesn't say very much about it. Does that make?
Yeah, I'm just curious what he means by this sort of intrinsic impossibility, right? That there's not this intrinsic connection. That seems like a plausible candidate to me, but I don't know if he had something else in mind.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So there's two, right? So. Of course, right, so he's also got the whole possible worlds account of modality, right? So he can't wheel that out as an objection to Armstrong. That would just be to beg the question. Armstrong's saying, look, there's this intrinsic notion of necessity, and Lewis goes, oh no, there can't be, because possible semantics, right? That was, so he's both got a positive story according to which it would be unintelligible to postulate these things, but I think he's, he independently thinks that they're unintelligible, right? And I think it is just that idea that, right, this is supposed to be a logical relation, and yet a natural relation at the same time.
I'm wondering how a strong or weaker human you would respond to Kant's principles of pure understanding, particularly the first analysis experience, because does not change in order for change to take place within it, and makes it possible all relations are successful and simultaneous events. And one of the first examples that come to mind is how that pure principle works as a transcendental principle that has no empirical content would be something with a special theory of relativity. That there's nothing that you can generate in experience and that our mind can create a representation of beyond the succession or simultaneous events. So in other words, it's not an answer to this idea of relation that can be conceived totally independently of issues of causation between events. So how would you respond to that, assuming that you come after the count?
Just run the first part again because I was having difficulty hearing.
So essentially what would be the response to his notion of the analogy of experience with regard to time and substance that makes possible all relations between successive and simultaneous events as a purely transcendental concept, so it has no empirical content. There's nothing in experience that years past. This idea that all events have either successive or simultaneous relationships. So it's a conception of a relationship that has nothing to do with causation. It's purely transcendental.
Oh, okay. Okay, so now is the question.
So how would either the strong or weak respond to that solution to this issue of the idea of a relationship that's conceivable?
I don't have an answer to that question. Why don't you guys have an answer to that question?
Last year,
It's like when people start talking about can, my eyes become I really don't know what to say about that. Sorry, I don't know nearly enough about Kant. No, they're not going to help me out.
Yeah, so I didn't fully hear the question either. Sorry about that. My fault. I mean, I guess what he was mostly saying about the argument of the second analogy, that argument doesn't work. And it's way too strong for conceivable to understand a world in which it's not entirely governed by uniform laws of nature. I think Hume has a certain Kantian thought, which is that ideas are not inherently representational, but represent only in virtue of the causal relations that they stand in to things that they're derived from and other things. So if there weren't causal relations, there couldn't be any thought. He would agree with that. But the ballpark.
Sure.
So we've had a little bit of Malebranche and Berkeley, Kant, and you muttered something about Spinoza. So now we're finally contextualizing some of these, that is, understanding Hume not through the lens of David Lewis, but there's something surrealistic in trying to think of, to make intelligible this notion of natural connections or necessary connections in nature, without thinking of Hume's predecessors. In my own case, I'm not a Hume scholar, but I always think of the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds as something that's derived from the nature of God and the definition of God in Leibniz, and that causal account that God has to create this world, which is the best of all possible worlds, is a causal connection that is, from the rationalist point of view, just determined a priori, as opposed to. So that's what Hume's principle is supposed to shut the door to, or Descartes' view that causality is not just putting one thing after the other in some regularity. There's the idea of the hierarchy and the status of whether something is an infinite substance or a mode, the argument in the third meditation, the complicated argument. Those are the kinds of things that Hume wants to rule out. But given those kinds of things and the sway they've had, it's hard to say that, as Eli does, that Hume's principle about distinct existences is just a priori obvious.
Right, yeah.
And maybe it's like the joke of the logician who is asked, is this proof obvious? And he stares at the board for an hour and he tells the student, yeah, it is obvious.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah. I mean, I am sympathetic to that thought. I mean, particularly given that it's not just Hume's predecessors who found all of these things entirely intelligible. But, I mean, in contemporary metaphysics, in the last 30 years, and particularly kind of the last 10 years, there's been a huge explosion of people who have suddenly discovered that the notion of natural necessity and indeed logical connections between events is entirely unmysterious and perfectly intelligent. And many of these people are very clever people who don't seem to me to be deluded in any obvious way. Right, so I do worry. Because a bit of me kind of wants to go, no, I don't understand what you're talking about here. Like, you're just, words are coming out of your mouth and I don't understand them. And then I think, no, but you understand what you're talking about. I think, yes, I think one has to be careful when one makes claims about what isn't intelligible, when there are so many other people who seem to find those claims entirely not only intelligible but actually true, right? So I think the time when you could kind of get away with saying, that's just unintelligible, I mean, in contemporary metaphysics anyway, you kind of can't get away with that anymore. You could for a while, but not anymore.
Would you call those the good old days? You could get them.
I just comment on that last thought, which is human psychology involves the positive thesis that our cognitive resources are very limited. They're limited to basically ideas of imagination and what Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz thought of as an intellect is a faculty we lack. A faculty for having very powerful non-imagistic ideas from which you could get a lot of rich content. But it's not as though he doesn't argue at all that we don't have such a thing. He said, first of all, people who claim to have one and get results from it never agree about what the results that they're getting from them are. I don't find that I have them, and my theory of abstract ideas will explain the kind of generality of thought that including mathematics, which people thought they had to have an intellect in order to explain. But it's entirely an empirical question whether other people have more.
Yeah, right. So maybe all these people who believe in fundamental dispositions and the like, they just have they've got some cognitive powers that I lack. Yeah. Could be true, yeah.
And he's betting not.
On that charitable note.